Indian women are seen to have a different kind of wealth. Since women don't have rights to land, they have other forms of wealth that become exchange at a marriage. Saris, clothing, gold, jewelry, utensils. So you can see property in India and even Hindu traditions are strongly gendered. Even cattle could be part of the marriage dowry. Now, cattle were sometimes worth more than gold. In these early days, in fact, they were so valuable that one Sanskrit word for warfare is gavishti, or the desire for cattle. For families, cattle were the most guarded animals and the ultimate stock of wealth. Now, to our modern ears, we might say, why? What can cattle provide? Well, think about it. Labor and a whole multitude of dairy products, like cheese, milk, and yogurt. All very good for you. Now, there's a reason why cattle became so crucial to Indian families and eventually broader Hindu traditions. Horses are not native to India. As the North Aryan peoples settled further into India, they found that the climate could not support the indigenous raising of horses. So rather than import horses from Central Asia, over centuries they discarded them and settled into lifestyles revolving around cattle. And this is the distant origin of India's reverence for cattle today. So think about it, back to marriage. What's the purpose of marriage? Simple, to continue the male's family lineage through time. Marriage is meant to amplify family honor, and it has to be done in very particular ways. Getting back to caste, first, they need to be from the same varna. Brahmins marry Brahmins, Vaishyas marry Vaishyas, and so on. But they have to be from a different family or jati within that broader caste. And this is done to avoid inbreeding. And they have to have, crucially, compatible horoscopes, which would of course be calculated by Brahmin priests. Now, because of the need to please your ancestors and family honor, marriages were usually arranged very early and often before puberty. But they wouldn't be consummated until after they became adults. And this is something the British never fully understood. But marriage in the Indian context is not about love, no matter how much Bollywood films insist that it is. The purposes of marriage were very practical. One way the family's honor is maintained is by initiating women into religious life. And this is done through marriage. Because in theory, she needs to be divorced from her ancestors in order to be added into a new family. And for men, it was the initiation into adulthood and the householder male phase of one's natural life cycle. So in a way, marriage is a gift of a daughter from one family to another. Think of it like a cosmic-oriented business transaction. And because marriage is an honor business transaction, it's a sacrament of religious obligation. It's a strict sacrament. It's arranged and nearly always cannot be dissolved. So as we've seen, family, marriage, ancestor worship, caste, karma, and dharma are all interrelated, and they really help us to understand how complex Hinduism is, not just as a philosophy, but also as a social tradition and a regular way of life. But it's important to stress that what we've covered is very much a high caste, Aryan era, and Brahmanical ideal. And not everyone in India fits this bill. Hinduism does contain deviations from this North Indian Vedic Aryan norm. And these counterpoints and regional differences would all become part of Hinduism, even if, to outsiders, it seemed inherently contradictory. One example would be if we look at low-caste families. Since low-caste families have always had less property and wealth, their families tended to lean towards the more one-generation or nuclear model, and with maybe 2 generations living together at most. If we go to the southern parts of India, families here historically tended to be slightly more matrilineal. And here, mothers and daughters were the real shareholders. Men were not betrothed, but lived with their own families. They visited their wives rather than residing with them. And royal South Indian wives often had multiple husbands. In fact, the symbol of a lover visiting an Indian royal wife was that the lover left his shield outside as a notice to others to stay away. And South Indian marriage patterns were also different from the North in other ways. In the north, first cousins were forbidden from marrying, but not in the south. It was allowed. And this was crucial because not only did it lessen the distinction between the bride's and the groom's families, but it allowed alliances between families to be perpetuated for longer over generations. There were also different marriage patterns when it came to religion. With the arrival of Islam after the 11th century, Islamic and Middle Eastern marriage patterns were kind of, in a way, injected and adopted into Indian tradition. This meant, in this tradition, there was a preference for patrilineal first cousins when arranging marriage. So in a way, this was more like South Indian traditions, but it was very different from the Vedic Aryan North. Now, when it comes to Indian Muslims, even they have adopted a modified version of caste. But it's not rooted in the concepts of dharma and the karma. It's not cosmological. It's largely based upon descent and claimed descent. Effectively, the way it works is like this. As an Indian Muslim, the more foreign lineage you can claim and display, the higher you're generally seen. So generally, Sayyids are higher because they claim descent from the Prophet Muhammad himself. Sheikhs also claim Arab lineage, usually from some of the foreign conquerors of India over past centuries. Ansaris are those who came from outside India and are usually considered clean and noble, and more so than indigenous Indian converts to Islam. Many have claimed to be those who helped the Prophet and Muslim conquerors of India. And there's a real Iranian and Persian residue too. Some very elite Muslim families trace their lineage to Persia, and their giveaway is in their last names, Shirazi, Esfahani, and Tabrizi. Before his grandfather moved back to Iran in the 1830s, Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, his family had lived in India for 2 centuries. In fact, his pen name was Syed Hindi, or the Syed from India. Now, given what we know about caste, which Hindus do you think were most likely to convert to Islam over the centuries? That's right, the low castes and untouchables. Aside from this caste heritage and hierarchy, most Indian Muslims today, probably between 70 and 80% of them in South Asia, can trace their lineage, if they wanted to being originally from untouchables and low caste Hindu families. Why? Islam offered them a theoretical egalitarianism and a way to escape pernicious caste discrimination. Okay, now that we've covered caste, let's talk about society and religion and how they shape politics in India. Indian empires were historically based upon intercepting surplus grains as revenue, taxing revenue. This was no different with the British after the 1750s. The agrarian wealth of India paid for administrations and armies. So rulers were always dependent upon the peasants and indeed the monsoon for their revenues. This made rulers sensitive to the well-being of Indian farmers and peasants. So the largely corporate, self-governing villages of India are what allowed great Indian empires, from Magadha in the 10th century BC to Vijayanagar in the 16th century, to the Mughals in the 17th, and to the British into the 19th, to flourish and rule. Now, traditionally, there have been 2 types of rule in India. The first was Rajya, or royal kingship. Now, Brahmins have traditionally preferred kingship. Why? Because it would allow Brahmins to be the advisors, to undertake rites to elevate the Raja over his enemies, and to read horoscopes, and to promote peace and prosperity and advice at the court. The second type of rule is what we would call Sangha. Now, Sangha means assembly or society. And this was kind of a more republican or confederated form of government. Kind of like the Roman Senate, it was for elites who deliberated. This was a form of rule that emerged from challenges to the priestly power of Brahmins. And it emerged in areas where the challenge to Brahmin spiritual dominance was most profound, namely Eastern India. It was no coincidence, therefore, that Buddhism emerged in the regions of India where Sangha forms of rule were somewhat more pronounced. Now, there's always been a tussle and a pull between these 2 forms of kingship in Indian history. But kingship, or Rajya, has largely won out over centuries. Over the eras, kingship emerged as the dominant form of political rule in India. And Indian kingship traditionally was benign, much more so than its equivalent in medieval Europe. In India, it never approached the levels of absolutism that we saw in 17th and 18th century Europe. because it was tempered by Brahmins and, crucially, the realities of the monsoon season. Plus, remember, caste and family units were like small corporations. Indian society would carry on whether the king was there or not. So as a result, rajas, or kings, styled themselves kind of as paternal protectors of their people. In India, kingship did not always equate with exploitation. Now, when Muslim rulers came to India, they obviously didn't need Brahmanical affirmation of their sovereignty. It came through conquest, and the Sultan was answerable, in theory, only to Allah. But Muslim rulers largely followed the patterns of kingship laid down by Indian tradition. Okay, so we've covered a great deal already. Let's stop for a moment and kind of recap what we've discussed. We've looked at Hinduism, its basic structure, its gods, and its cosmological precepts of karma, dharma, and samsara. We've seen how the traditions of caste, marriage, and family are all bound up with paying homage to the family's ancestors. And we've looked at how dharma and karma and forms of political rule were all shaped by these. In all, we saw how Hinduism was not so much a strict singular religion as it was the accumulation of various social, religious, and cosmological traditions over centuries. One major change we'll see in this course, in fact, is how British rule helped make Hinduism more of a monolithic, uniform religion than it ever was in history. So we now have a base understanding of caste, Hinduism, and Indian society. And what we're going to see in this course is how these broader aspects of India and the lives of millions of its inhabitants were affected by the experience of rule from a far-off, seemingly insignificant island off the coast of northwestern Europe.